Hi, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to part 2 of Lecture 1, Introduction to Ethical Philosophy. And in this part, having already discussed philosophy in general, we're going to finally turn our attention right to a closer examination of our subject matter for the course, ethical philosophy, discuss ethics itself, talk about the branches of ethics. So that's the strategy here for the second part of the lecture. So without further ado, right, we kind of have a general sense of what ethical philosophy is about. Right? We hear the terms right, wrong, good, and evil. We hear these terms all the time, and no doubt, again, many of us probably use them probably daily, right? Or at least very frequently. And so, really, what moral philosophy or ethical philosophy is about is getting to the heart of that, right? On what basis are we doing that sort of thing? All right, do we have a good solid foundation to be doing that, or should we not be making these kinds of moral judgments, especially if we never reflect on it, right? If we never reflect on these kinds of issues, like what does it mean to be right and wrong? If we never make these kinds of or reflect on these kinds of things, should we be in fact making moral judgments to begin with? Right. So these are kind of the kinds of things that the moral philosopher is interested in. And so that's what, as we'll see, right? We'll see that that's what the kinds of thing that moral philosopher is interested in, and we'll see the various kinds of ways that moral philosophers approach the subject as well through the discussion of these various categories here in a moment. But first, I think it helps when you're first starting to talk about moral or ethical philosophy. It's helpful to juxtapose morality with science. So that's the first thing I do typically if I'm teaching this face to face. When we turn our attention to ethical philosophy like we are now, right? I would give an example where I would say, okay, if there was a scientist, right, in the room, they would make a kind of claim like this. They might say something like they would count the number of people present and say there are 20 people present, right? They're making a descriptive claim. That's what this word says here. Descriptive claim about what just is the case, right? There's no moral undertones about what should be the case, right? There are, or this is how it is, right? There is, or are would be more than one, right? So there are 20 people here, right? That's what we mean by a kind of scientific claim. The moral philosopher, though, insofar as they're doing moral philosophy, right, making a moral claim, they would say something like, "Let me see your attendance sheet." Well, it says here there's 25. There should be 25 students present, right? So notice the different type of claim there, right? They're saying something about never mind what actually is the case, what should be the case, what ought to be the case, right? So they're prescribing their claim, right? They're offering prescriptive claims, saying something about how things ought to be, right? Prescribing what we ought to do. Whereas the scientist, right, or science in general, is interested in descriptive claims, just describing, not prescribing how things ought to be, but rather just describing how things actually are. Okay, so again, prescriptive versus descriptive, is versus ought. Okay, those are good. That's a good distinction to have in mind rather when you're trying to get a firm grasp on what exactly we're trying to do with moral philosophy. For our purposes, and I mentioned this at the bottom of slide 10. I think it's worth highlighting here, right? Okay, we're not going to bother ourselves differentiating between certain terms, right? For us, normative is equivalent to ought, is equivalent to prescriptive, is equivalent to moral, is equivalent to ethical, right? These are all synonymous. The same is true of the terms ethics and morality. We're not going to bother distinguishing between the two. Ethics is morality for us, even though many textbooks, ethical textbooks will say something to distinguish the two. We're not going to worry about that. So moving on to slide 11 of lecture 1, we'll go ahead and turn our attention then, having discussed how morality is generally distinguished from science, right? And what our business as moral philosophers is going to look like, having sort of tried to generally characterize that. Let's talk about then ethics itself, and its three basic categories. So we talked about the primary categories of philosophy: epistemology, metaphysics, logic, and ethics. And now there are actually sub-branches, if you will, of ethics itself, right? It has then 3 sub-branches, right? On the one hand, we have ethical theory. We also have applied ethics, and then we have meta-ethics. So three sub-branches, okay? Ethical theory, what is that? It's basically asking the question, what should we do in general or in theory, right? So we have basically that's what we're studying. For better or worse, most of our course is going to consist of studying these different ethical theories. Utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, right? They're all going to offer slightly different takes, in terms of how we ought to approach morality in a general sense. Okay, so the distinguishing factor here, right, is ethical theory is a broad, general sort of thing. It's saying what should you do. It's just sort of giving you guiding principles. So the utilitarian, for example, no matter what situation you're dealing with, always do whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But by and large, that's what we're going to be doing throughout the course is, going through and familiarizing ourselves with these various ethical theories, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, right? And then hopefully we'll find the one that we think sort of best fits the bill, if you will. Okay, so that's ethical theory in general. Then we have applied ethics, and that's also interested in what we should do, right? But it's more interested in what we should do in practice or in particular scenarios, in particular situations, right? So what should we do in the emergency room, or what should we do inside the classroom, or what should we do with regard to abortion or the death penalty, right? Particular issues in ethics or particular scenarios. That's applied ethics. That makes sense, right? Applied. It's ethics applied. So some, good examples would be classroom ethics, business ethics, medical ethics. You can take entire courses on these particular aspects of applied ethics. And while our course I already mentioned will be heavily focused on ethical theory, right? We'll allude to a whole slew of issues in applied ethics throughout the course. Right? And finally, we have what is considered meta ethics. Okay? This is kind of the oddball in the sense that it's not interested in what we should do, right? Or what we ought to do, which is how we distinguished what ethics was in the first place, right? But it's actually interested in the very nature of ethics itself, right? So the meta-ethicist isn't concerned with telling us what we should do in general or what we should do inside the classroom or inside the emergency room, but rather the meta-ethicist is interested in the very subject of ethics, right? What does a moral claim look like? How would we go about defending a moral claim if we can defend it at all? These sorts of questions are what the meta-ethicist is concerned with. Okay, so sort of the oddball, if you will, within those branches. Okay, turning to slide 12 then, I want to note that ethical theory and applied ethics are known together as normative ethics. Okay, that's important to know, right? They're both normative. They're both interested in telling us what we ought to do. The only difference, as I already alluded to, right, is that ethical theory is more broad in scope, speaking in general terms. Always promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Whereas applied ethics is concerned with particular scenarios or situations or issues. Okay, but either way, right? They're both interested in telling us what we should or should not do. Okay, whereas meta-ethics isn't concerned with that. So these two together, known as normative ethics. Okay. We should point out that although we're going to be focusing primarily on ethical theory, these are all very much intertwined, right? Ethical theory would be pretty empty if you espoused an ethical theory but then never applied it to anything, right? And how can you talk about applied ethics without having some sort of ethical theory to apply, right? And so, again, all these are kind of intermingled, although, again, hopefully you can kind of see how they have their distinct, areas of emphasis, if you will. Okay, let's move on. So this will be slide 13 for you then. I want to make a brief comment. So oftentimes when I teach philosophy, I'll get the question, how is this relevant? Or it doesn't seem, how is this helpful for me? But ethics, I think, that's something that I don't face that question quite as much, right? Because we all hear morality on an everyday basis. We are familiar with evil events and so on. But I still think it would behoove us to point out, right, or think about just how often morality really does affect us, right? And that that it really, in some sense, is a question or an issue that faces us every moment of our lives. Because if you think about it, right, the question what you should do is something that is staring you in the face every moment of your existence. No matter what it is you're doing, you could always be doing something else, right? You're watching this video, but you could be catching up on sleep. And there's always these other options, and so there's always this open question are you doing the right thing, or should you be doing something else? Now, obviously, some, you know, dilemmas, so to speak, are much more consequential than others, right? So I give you the crass example of deciding whether to listen to Elton John or pluck your leg hairs or do both at the same time, much less consequential than deciding whether to jump into a burning car to save a complete stranger, right? But they're both, in some sense, moral dilemmas, right? And in some sense, I think it's worth thinking about just how we are facing a moral dilemma every waking moment of our life. So never doubt, the upshot of all this is never doubt the extent to which this course really does apply to your life. Okay, so another important sort of aspect of ethical philosophy that we'll be talking a lot about, right, is the foundation for it. How do we go about getting our moral compass? How do we go about figuring out what's right and what's wrong? And really, that's what the whole course revolves around, right? Is figuring that out. What is the foundation of morality? That's where all these authors in here are going to disagree about. Okay, so I just wanted to go through a few of these, options that are going to be offered throughout the course. What is the foundation of morality? Some would say societal convention. Somebody like Thomas Hobbes, who we're going to study very early, right? Two lectures from now, he's going to say morality is nothing other than the laws we've all agreed to, right? Go back to what he calls the state of nature, take us out of society, and there's no such thing as morality. It's only after we get out of this state of nature, come together, form a society, and agree to certain laws that we have morality. And that's just doing what the law says, basically, for him. Now, if you're one who thinks certain things like murder, rape, those kinds of things are just wrong no matter what, then societal convention, moral conventionalism, Hobbes's moral theory, that shouldn't sit well with you, right? Because he's saying there's no such thing as morality, in a state of anarchy. Murder, rape, those things aren't really wrong unless they're stipulated as being wrong as a matter of convention in our laws. So that's just one sort of view on the foundation of morality. God and religion is cited as another source or foundation for morality. A conscience, right? Some people root morality in sort of more natural feelings. David Hume, who we won't talk a lot about, talks about how we like to think of it as a rational process, but really morality is rooted in our natural sentiments, right? We feel repulsed by somebody getting hurt for no reason by someone else, right? Or we naturally feel guilty if we hurt someone for no reason, right? So to what extent are our natural sentiments and feelings playing a role? Hume would say quite a lot, right? So this notion of conscience or our natural sentiments. What about this notion of duty? Immanuel Kant, we mentioned him in the part one of the lecture. He's going to have a lot of duty talk, right? It's all about abiding by the sense of duty, which for him we can figure out with our rational capacity, using our reason. Okay, speaking of reason, does reason matter? Is that a big player in morality and figuring out what's right and what's wrong? How important is our rational capacity? For someone like Immanuel Kant, it makes all the difference. For other people like Jeremy Bentham and some utilitarians, it doesn't seem to make much difference at all, that the fact that we have this rational capacity. So how important is reason and our ability to be rational creatures? How important is that in this morality business? You get a lot of difference in opinion on that issue. Pursuit of happiness. Is morality about the pursuit of happiness? For the utilitarians, that's what morality is all about, right? It's maximizing happiness for the greatest number. John Stuart Mill, for example, is going to say that. Versus somebody like Immanuel Kant, a deontologist, is going to say morality has nothing to do with happiness. And the more what you're doing is based on happiness, the less morally praiseworthy what you're doing is. Somebody like Immanuel Kant's going to say. So they're going to totally disagree with the utilitarians. Is morality about happiness? Yes, if you ask the utilitarians. No, if you ask the deontologists. So again, you're starting to get a glimpse of just how much difference there is in opinion regarding a lot of these issues in ethical philosophy. How important are the consequences of what we're doing, right? Is that what matters morally, right? We have an action. Is it the intent that matters, or the motive, or is it the consequences? Believe it or not, that says consequences, right? What matters? What is the most morally pertinent feature of our actions? Is it what follows from them, or is it what we had in mind when we did them? Right? Well, the utilitarians, people like Mill, are going to focus on the consequences. Did it make people happy? That's all that matters. Whereas people like deontologists are going to say no, right? The consequences don't matter. It's what you had in mind, what motivated you to act. That's what's most morally important. Okay. How about habits? Does that matter? the sort of tendencies we have. That's what Aristotle and the virtue ethicists focus on. They want to say what matters is our character, our tendencies over time, the types of habits we've established, right? And the job of the morally praiseworthy person is to fine tune their character or their habits, right? Get rid of bad habits and promote good habits that will make you happier in the long run. How much of a role does our culture or environment play in morality? Right? There are moral relativists who say morality depends on one's culture. Right? It's stipulated by what the culture says. Okay, and we'll read Ruth Benedict, who's a famous proponent of moral relativism. We'll read her later down the road. And then finally, there are some for whom there is no foundation of morality. Someone like Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll go through and we'll survey all these various moral theories, the most famous moral theories of all time, and then we'll end the course by discussing Nietzsche, who's a moral skeptic and says there is no such thing as right and wrong, right? It's just an illusion we've created to feel a little bit more comfortable as we ease our way through life, okay? But that was just a glimpse of all the different, options that have been offered in terms of where we can try to get our moral compass, where we can look in terms of finding the foundation of morality. I also wanted to briefly mention, again, we're going to focus in almost exclusively on ethical theory, but I wanted to mention that, we'll be talking a lot about various issues in applied ethics, and just mention a few, basically anything about which you can have a moral debate is an issue in applied ethics, right? It's seemingly endless, right? The different issues in applied ethics you can come up with, right? So on the slide, what is it, 15? I'll rattle off a few here: abortion, affirmative action, animal rights, the death penalty, drug prohibition, censorship, immigration, government policy, human rights, war, euthanasia, sports, gun control, suicide, crime, stem cell research, commercialism, technology, the environment, community interest, nationalism, sex, religion, science, terrorism, on and on and on and on. These are all issues in applied ethics, right? They're all sort of scenarios that we can take our more broad ethical theories and apply them to, right, and try to say something about. And so I wanted to, again, try to give you a sort of sample of what some issues in applied ethics would look like, right? And it really is limitless. It's really limitless. Again, it's anything about which you can have a moral debate, right? That's an issue in applied ethics. A few concluding remarks, and then we'll wrap up this first lecture. So I already mentioned this right earlier. Our subject, philosophy in general and ethics in particular, is hard enough as it is. So we're not going to bother distinguishing morality and ethics. For us, we're using those interchangeably. Okay. And again, ethics, prescriptive, ethical, prescriptive, moral, normative. Those all are the same sort of claim, right? As opposed to a descriptive or scientific claim. So if you were to have a question on the quiz, which one doesn't fit? And you heard prescriptive, moral, normative, descriptive, you would pick descriptive, right? Anyway, I was pointing out how, prescriptive, normative, moral, all those are synonymous. They mean the same thing. So too, morality and ethics in general for us are going to mean the same thing, okay? And then in sum, as Lewis Vaughan, he was an editor of one of my previous textbooks that I used to use. As he suggests, I really like how he summarizes what we're up to in a moral philosophy class. The aim of moral philosophical analysis is to guide, quote, us to moral principles, theories, or insights beneath the everyday muddle of emotion, prejudice, and custom, end quote. So, again, we're all used to these terms, right, wrong, good, and evil, and we no doubt use them ourselves, right? But have we ever sat down to think about, what we actually mean when we say those kinds of things, right? And that's what we're going to do in this course. That's what we're up against. So having said that, then I'll go ahead and end by just putting up, right, the questions at the end of the lecture that you can then post a response to if you choose. Whoops. So again, this is the reflection time questions. You need to respond to either one of these or one of the intermission questions that I put up at the end of the first part. And so these questions, reflection time questions, are basically asking you to gauge, right, how much you tend to invoke moral terms like right, wrong, good, and evil, and then also how often you tend to reflect on them, if at all. And then finally, the third one asks you to chime in on your, what your opinion is in terms of where we find the foundation of morality, or where we ought to find our compass, our moral compass. So you can pick one of those or answer them all, right? But the idea is, again, make sure you're answering one substantively, right? Thoroughly. Otherwise, that's it for lecture one. If you have any questions about anything, I've discussed in the lecture, feel free to, shoot me an email or post something in the forums. We'll move on into lecture 2, which is on logic, coming up in the next video, and I'll start that video by speaking a bit of it again about the importance of talking a little bit about logic, even though we're talking about ethical philosophy. Why talk about logic? Again, I'll speak to that a little bit more at the beginning of the next video. Thanks.